everybody. Okay, folks might still trickle in the next few minutes, but for the sake of time, I'll go ahead and get us started. So, my name is Renata Stankowska. I'm the Assistant Director for Membership Services here at ODK, and thank you all for joining us today. Jamie Bolden, the Director for Membership Services with ODK, will be speaking to us today about some interview tips. So, Jamie, I'll pass it on to you.
Oh, thanks, Renata. So, as Renata said, I'm Jamie Bolden. I'm our Director for Membership Services for ODK's national headquarters. A little about my background. I've been with ODK. August will be 5 years that I've worked for ODK's national headquarters. But prior to that, I spent 5 years as the director of a career services office for kind of a mid-sized state public institution. And so I have a lot of experience with being an interviewer, being an interviewee. And one thing that I have noticed over the years during my career is that oftentimes interviewees struggle with articulating their experiences. And it was particularly, hard sometimes to be in those interviews with folks who had such great leadership experiences and weren't able to articulate them in a way that really conveyed their skills. And so that's what we're going to focus on a little bit today. Because, we know that one thing, ODK is not a discipline based society. We've got folks in from all kinds of majors and career fields, all sorts of different experiences. But one thing that ODK members all have in common is that everyone has leadership experience. You had to have leadership experience in order to get accepted into ODK, but then you also, we know, go on to do, to continue to have great experiences once you complete, your university time and move out into your career field. So we know that you've got the leadership experience, whether it comes from work experience, whether it comes from, volunteer opportunities, civic engagement outside of your job. We know that you've got the leadership experience. What we're going to focus on today is how to identify and articulate those experiences to tell your story to potential employers in a more effective way. So, to tell you just kind of a little bit about how the presentation is going to run, we're going to go over, I have some slides to share where we'll talk a little bit about behavioral interviews and what skills employers are looking for, things like that. So we'll spend some time talking about that. Then we're going to move into the interactive component of the presentation today, where we're going to split you guys into pairs and put you into breakout rooms and give you some sample interview questions to be able to practice with each other. So we want you guys to hear about, some tips and tricks for this, and then to be able to actually put it into practice with a partner. We'll go through at least one question, maybe two questions, depending on how time is treating us. And then we'll come back together for some discussion about kind of how it went and any questions that you guys may have. As we go through, if you have any questions, you're welcome to drop them into the chat. I've got the chat open on my screen, and so I'm happy to take questions as we go. But so when we get to the interactive portion, we're going to give you guys some instructions for that as well, because we know that not everybody may be listening to this call in a place where you can engage with an activity. And so we'll talk about that in a little bit. But so when we're looking to articulate these experiences to tell the story to potential employers, excuse me. A lot of times this is referred to as behavioral interview. So, in a behavioral interview, you are asked to provide specific real life examples to demonstrate your skills. So this is where you see questions phrased as, tell me about a time when, give me an example of, These sorts of questions are asking you to very specifically offer examples of, times in your experience where you've had the opportunity to showcase that skill. But what are some of the skills that employers are looking for? So we're going to dive into a little bit of research for a second. So there's an organization called NACE, the National Association of Colleges and Employers. And every year, NACE puts together a job outlook survey that they send to their employer partners. And so one of the questions on this survey that career services folks pay attention, we wait for this all year. What are the skills that employers are looking for? So for here, it says, what are they looking for on resumes? We can easily extend that out to say, if they're looking for it on your resume, they're likely to ask you about it in an interview, right? Like if they're looking for that skill to see if you're qualified for the position, it's likely that when they get you in for an interview, that they're going to ask you to tell me about a time when you utilize your problem solving skills, things like that. So these kinds of lists are really helpful, even if you're not a recent graduate. These kinds of lists are really helpful in thinking about what are the different kinds of skills that I may be asked about in an interview. So research like this is really helpful, but also thinking about looking at the job description. So when you applied for the job and there was a list of the skills that you had to have in order to be potentially qualified for that position, that's a great resource as well. So thinking about not only these kinds of lists and research that you do online, but also utilizing that job description, that it's likely that they're looking for those specific skills on your resume, and then they're going to ask you to expand upon those skills in an interview. Again, these are not like discipline specific. The ability to work in a team is as applicable to psychology major as it is to a computer science major, right? Like what you may do in those teams is very different, but having the skill of teamwork, it goes across disciplines. So another thing that, a lot of times folks will try to solely draw off of work experience when they're answering these types of questions. And so I had a lot of experiences where I would be interviewing students who had leadership roles, sometimes in ODK, sometimes, in Greek Life or other student organizations, but they weren't utilizing those leadership experiences to explain their skills. They were focusing solely on internship or classwork or things like that. And, they were really missing an opportunity because as a leader in these student organizations, they were doing teamwork. They were having to solve problems. They were having to communicate. They were sometimes gaining technical skills depending on the organization. So, drawing not only from your work experience, but thinking broader than that about your volunteer experience, your civic engagement opportunities, service opportunities, things like that. We can gain skills from a wide variety of areas. So this is a quote from the president and CEO of NACE from this year. Again, just kind of, driving home the point of that our job seekers need to be reflecting on academic, experiential, extracurricular, and work experiences to identify the skills that they have sharpened. So not only do you need to know what skills you have, but you have to think about how am I going to communicate those skills to an interviewer without taking 30 minutes, right? We have to be able to convey examples in a clear and concise way. And that requires us thinking about it ahead of time. So when preparing for these job interviews, looking at all these different skills that employers are looking for or pulling from the job description and saying, okay, what are examples that I have from my experience that I can talk about in a clear and concise way to help convey that I have these skills. It's not enough to say, oh, I have really great communication skills. Like that doesn't prove anything to me. I can tell you all day long that I can do a backflip. Until you see me do a backflip, you probably shouldn't believe that I can. It's a similar thing in job interviews. Everybody talks about that they work hard. Everybody talks about that they have, good communication skills. The folks that are more likely to advance are the ones who can provide an example, a very specific example to back up that claim. So one thing that I recommend is, literally writing down examples, thinking through ahead of job interviews and ahead of just kind of the job seeking experience. What are different stories that I can tell to help to convey these kinds, these particular skills? One story may convey multiple skills. You may be able, and we'll talk about that in a minute with an example, but you may be able to have one or two stories that touch on six or seven, of these in here. You don't want to just repeat the same story over and over, but you don't necessarily have to have 20 different stories at the ready. One story may be able to convey teamwork and problem solving and communication skills. So thinking of, a variety of examples that you can offer. So once you've generated some of those examples, and what it is that you're wanting to talk about, then the next step is thinking about how do we convey those experiences in a clear and concise way that allows us to really showcase those skills and those experiences that we have. So that's where the STAR method comes in. So the STAR method is a structured manner of responding to these behavioral-based interview questions. So tell me about a time when, give me an example of, tell me about a problem that you had to solve or a time that you had to resolve a conflict. A lot of different, you can phrase these in a lot of different ways, but generally we can use the STAR method to answer as a structured way of answering almost any kind of, question. So what the STAR method is that we think about what the situation was. So we want to briefly describe and we're going to go through one question and kind of break it down here in the next few slides. But so thinking about what is the specific situation? It can be from a job or a volunteer experience or a leadership role that you had. I generally do advise not conveying super personal or like intimate details in there. We want to try to keep it generally to jobs, volunteer experiences, organizations, leadership roles, things like that. Occasionally personal examples can be relevant. And so you don't have to completely nix that. But you just want to, if we ask about, tell us about a time that you helped to resolve a conflict, talking about how you resolved a conflict within your friend group is very different than, or a personal situation is very different maybe than how we would handle, and approach that situation in a professional setting. So to just be mindful of, we really want to try to keep our examples in these situations from, work and volunteer experiences and leadership roles. So briefly describing that specific situation, you want to offer enough enough specificity to where they really understand the context of it. So, but avoiding like a lot of acronyms and things like that. So saying, well, when I was in the URHC in my graduate program at the University of Tennessee, that was the United Residence Hall Council. It was what we called the Residence Hall Association. Nobody outside of the University of Tennessee calls it URHC. So when I talked about that in my job interviews after I finished grad school, I had to be really mindful of that, of saying, when I was the graduate assistant for the United Residence Hall Council, which represented all 15 of the residence halls and the residents at the University of Tennessee. So providing enough example, enough specificity to let them know what it is without having to say, and the URHC met every week and we had this many officers and things like that. Unless it's super relevant or gives them really important detail, you just want to be mindful of trying to stay concise. So telling them what the specific situation is, What are the tasks you had to complete and what was the goal that you were working toward? Action, you want to outline the specific actions that you took to achieve the goals that you set. Ideally, you want to include metrics where appropriate or available. It doesn't have to be so specific to say we increased our revenue 15.73%. But, saying we increased our revenue by 15% is a much more vivid way to convey that than saying, oh, we raised more money. So being mindful of being able to provide metrics to back up what you're saying. Again, you notice I underlined you here. So you want to, when we're thinking about things that we accomplished as part of a team or things that we accomplished as part of a larger group, we don't want to make it sound like, oh, it's all about me. But also you want to be mindful of they're not hiring your team, they're hiring you. So you can, provide credit to others in there or how well the team worked together. But you really want to try to focus on what were the actions that you took? What is the story conveying about you as a potential employee for this organization? And then finally telling me what the result was. So you want to describe the outcome of your actions and what you learned. And again, don't be shy about taking credit where credit is due. So an example of a behavioral question would be, tell me about a time that you had a significant impact on a project. So I chose this example because it doesn't outright convey what the skill is that they're looking for. When you get a question like, tell me about a time that you resolved a conflict, they're looking for conflict resolution and communication skills, right? Like it's pretty straightforward. Questions like this can be a little murkier. So, we want to think about what are the types of skills they might be looking to hear about when they ask a question like this. So if you guys will drop in the chat, looking at this list of skills, what do you think are maybe the top 2 or 3 things that they might be looking for when they ask a question like this one? Okay, ability to work in a team. Yeah. The term project in there does, you can generally interpret that as something that you're maybe working on with other people. Verbal communication, great. Communication and adaptability, initiative, perfect. So, any and all of these skills would be appropriate skills to convey when we're thinking about, tell me about a time that you had a significant impact on a project. So I'm going to show you guys an example of what is kind of a typical answer that I would get from someone who did not know about the STAR method and, wasn't answering this as a behavioral based question. So, I worked on a team project at my last job that was really important. I helped out with a lot of different things and made sure everything got done on time. The project turned out well and everyone was happy with the results. I think my communication and teamwork skills had a big impact on making the project successful. So, what are some things that you guys see as maybe lacking in this answer? Y'all are welcome to unmute or you can put it into the chat. But what are some things that you feel like are maybe not strengths? No specificity. Yep. So I don't know what the project was. I don't know what your job was, other than you made sure things got done on time. I don't know what you did. So it's not specific enough. Anybody else? No metrics. Yeah. The project turned out well and everyone was happy with the results. I don't know what that means, right? Like I don't know if you were raising money. I don't know if you were selling things. I don't know what you were doing or how we measured success in this situation. And then Bella says, doesn't give enough context or examples of personal impact. So, a lot of times folks will think if I say the skills in there, then they will then assume that I have them, right? So for this and the last sentence, I think my communication and teamwork skills had a big impact on making the project successful. Saying you have it, without providing the example doesn't really mean a lot to the employer. So perfect. So you guys tapped into exactly what I wanted y'all to tap into on that. So now we're going to look at an example that provides, is still pretty concise, but provides some more specificity. And I've blocked out in here the different parts of the STAR method. What you don't want to do, just to be clear, is for every question say, well, the situation was this, and the task was this, and the action was this, and the result was this. So we don't want to necessarily break it down when we're interviewing like that. But it's a helpful thing to keep in mind for structuring your answers. So for this one, it says, the situation, ad revenue was declining for my college newspaper, and many of our long-term advertisers were not renewing their contracts. The task, my goal was to generate some new ideas and incentives that would result in at least a 15% increase in advertisers. Action, so what did I do to accomplish that task? I designed a new promotional packet to accompany the rate sheet. I compared the benefits of our circulation with other ad media in the area. I also set up a training session for the account executives with a business professor. And then as a result, we signed contracts with 15 former advertisers for daily ads and 5 for special supplements. We increased the number of new advertisers by 20% over the same period in the last year. So this one is much more specific without going into just excruciating detail, right? So in reading this example, what are some of those skills that we see in here? Or what are the skills that you guys see conveyed through their response to that question? Measurable outcomes. Yep. So they said, my goal was X. This was what we did for Y. Results directly linked to the task. Perfect. So, this was my goal. This was what we tried. This was the result. I will say you don't always have to convey stories that are necessarily success stories. Sometimes you're going to get asked about a time that you failed or something didn't go the way it was planned. I think it's okay to say this was our goal. These were all the things that we tried. It didn't work out the way that we wanted it to, right? I wouldn't necessarily use that for all of your stories. But it is okay to talk about when something didn't work out. A pet peeve of mine when I would interview people is, when you would ask them for like a strength and a weakness, and like everybody's weakness was I worked too hard. And it was like, or we could talk about an actual weakness and how you've been addressing it. So it is okay to, convey a weakness or to talk about, hey, it didn't work out how we wanted it to. This was what I learned from that experience. Okay, so perfect. All right, so now we're going to move into the practice portion of this. So what we're going to do is assign you guys into some breakout rooms. I saw the note from Daryl saying that he can't participate. Is there anyone else who is in a place where they can't, you don't have to turn your camera on necessarily, but to where you can't speak in the breakout rooms, essentially. Okay, so Christopher and Daryl. Okay. Oh, okay. Maybe most people in there. Got 4. Okay. All right. So what we're going to do is we'll have, so the 4 folks who can't participate in there, we're going to keep you guys in the main room with us. But then Renata, can you assign out the other folks into the breakout rooms?
So that does leave 3
Okay. Let's just
to,
put them into the same room.
okay.
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 Oh, All right, we're gonna pivot a little bit then, because if we've got it's okay. If we've got almost everyone who's not able to go into the breakout room, I don't want to just put folks into one in there. So, um, okay, so let's pivot a little bit here. What kinds of, and y'all can drop them in the chat or you can unmute. Are there any questions so far about the STAR method or about, and the skills that we've talked about? Any questions that you guys have so far? Okay, go ahead, Will. Will, while you're typing your question in there, oh, any other way to convey, yep, a measurable outcome that's not a piece of numerical data. Um, just thinking. So it doesn't always have to be like overly specific. When I think about my experiences, I haven't always necessarily written down, oh, from like this year our assessment said this, and the next year our assessment said that. So it is okay to kind of speak in generalities, occasionally that, our numbers were up, we increased, not always necessarily, especially on the spot, going to be able to remember like a piece of numerical data. I think it is, a lot of times though, our measurable outcomes are associated with numbers and figures in there though. Same question. Job, but not. I think it doesn't necessarily always have to be tied to money. So like my example about assessment. So, we do a lot of assessment with ODK. So, a piece of data that I might talk about is, we read, so like for example, we have our Circle annual report available right now for our Circle officers to complete. So we're taking the results of that assessment. One of the questions on that survey is, what are the areas in which you need assistance from the national headquarters? So we are taking those results and we are using them to create advisor listening sessions this summer. So we're going to share the results of that data, with the advisors, and then the ODK team is going to be listening to the advisors tell us about what are their needs and what are the specific things that you need in these areas. So for that example, that would be like taking initiative, right? Like we've got this data and then we're doing something with it. I don't necessarily have a measurable outcome for that, right? Like it's not something where I expect to see. I think the data is going to be pretty similar year over year in our annual report. They're always generally going to need help with the same things. I think what we're doing for that is helping to show some initiative and some communication and problem solving by saying, okay, this is what we're doing about it. Like we're going to share this data. We're going to listen directly to the audience, so that might be an example of kind of an outcome where we could talk about the result and what I did with it. But I don't necessarily have a metric to tie to that yet. Does that make sense? So we can think about, outcomes and metrics. They don't always necessarily have to be tied to like sales figures or percentages. There may be things that you could talk about, like what you've done as a result of getting that information, but it may not be something that's necessarily strongly tied to numbers in there. Okay, perfect. All right, I'm gonna show you guys the questions that we would have done in the breakout rooms, and we'll talk about them a little bit. So I was going to have y'all practice, this one about a time you had a significant impact on a team or a project. We've talked about that a little bit, about what some of the skills that we might be looking for in that. So this one's the other one. So what was a difficult decision that you made as a leader? So again, in these, we'd want to utilize the STAR technique. So thinking about the situation, what was the leader, what was the organization in which you were a leader, telling me enough about it to give me context, but not an overwhelming amount of information. So thinking about what the situation was, what was the task that you were given, what was the difficult decision that you were facing, how did you come to that, how did you come to that decision? This is what I decided to do and why. And then telling me what the result was of that. So for this question, we might be looking to convey our problem solving skills, our teamwork skills, our communication skills, both written and verbal communication could come into play here. So, a number of different skills that we might be able to convey based on what that difficult decision was. So, we also are talking about leadership skills, and that is listed in the list of the NACE skills. But I think that in these interviews, it's a little more nuanced than just saying, like, I have strong leadership skills. Like, strong leaders, our skill set is comprised of all the different skills that were listed, right? Strong leaders are good team players. We have good communication skills. We are able to be innovative. We're able to solve problems. And so, when you think about a question like this, I think it would be a mistake to say, oh, well, I utilized my strong leadership skills in order to solve this problem. Like, I don't know what that means to you. What leadership is sometimes defined differently based on different people. So focusing more on some of those other skills, instead telling me about how you solved a problem, how you effectively communicated, how you worked together as a team, what you did when you faced disappointment from that difficult decision. There's a lot of different skills that we could focus on with this question, as opposed to just saying, I used my strong leadership skills. Any questions about that? Okay. So the last thing that I want to touch on is to think about how the interview process can is being affected by the use of artificial intelligence. Now, I will be quick to say, I did spend 5 years as the director of a career services program, but I have not actively been engaged with career services in the last 5 years. And oh my gosh, things have changed in the past 5 years. So I think that, from my reading and research into kind of the modern interview process, the STAR technique, I think, will always be applicable. I think that both humans and AI agents who are conducting interviews are looking for specificity. They're looking for examples. They're looking for eye contact. They're looking for not having a ton of filler words, not using the word like all the time or, all the time in there. So I think that both humans and AI agents that are conducting these interviews sometimes they are still looking for specificity and examples. So I think all of this still applies. I think that it would be a mistake though to kind of not talk about how this is shaping, the modern interview process. So, in doing some research on this, these were just some of the examples of headlines that I found. And it was really interesting because it was kind of wildly all over the place. Like some you can see the one on the bottom left that says that job candidates are over it and they don't like how, AI interviews are becoming more and more common. And then others are saying, other articles were saying, no, like people are leaning into this, this is how to be successful in that. So, I don't know if there's a right or wrong. It just is. Like this is just what modern interviewing looks like. I am curious for those of y'all who are in attendance, you know, so in my job search experience, I have never had an AI interview experience. I've never had to do a video recorded interview, or where I was engaging with some kind of a chatbot. I am curious from those of y'all who are in here, if anybody has had that experience, have you guys had screenings or full-on interviews that were done via, chatbot or some kind of AI tool? not seeing anybody jump into the chat with it. I'd quit the hiring process too. It, I've had a recorded one once. Yeah, I think one thing, so I'm going to show some and video recorded interview. So video recorded interviews, I was in my previous position, we utilized a vendor that did video that offered video recorded interview, platform for our students to use. And we pushed that a lot as a way for students to be able to practice telling these stories, right? That, just going on these interviews spur of the moment, having never said, spoken these examples out loud, it's generally not a great idea. So we pushed it as a practice tool. But we found more and more that candidates were getting sent something similar to that. They were getting sent a link, and within that system, it would record their responses, and they were, getting asked 5 or 6 questions that they had to record a response to. So, towards the end of my time in that role, we were pushing that software as a way to practice for those experiences. So the video recorded interviews, those have been around for a while. So I want to share some information in here from some of the articles. So this one, it talked about, a pretty broad survey of about 3,000 job seekers across a variety of countries. And about 63% said they'd been interviewed by some kind of AI tool, up 13 percentage points from just 6 months prior. What I gathered, and kind of gleaned from these articles that I had read, it talked about that one thing that was frustrating to candidates was that employers were not very clear about that the use of AI, that they would go into an interview expecting it to be a human on the other side of the camera, and instead they were engaging with some kind of a chat bot or doing a video recorded interview. And so that seemed to be a frustration that rose quite a bit. And so that would be something that I would think about, asking for clarity on in your process, is to not assume in an interview process, is to not assume that it's always going to be a live human on the other side of it, that knowing that these tools are pretty widely used, and that interviewers are saying that companies are not always upfront about the use of those tools. So ask if you're working with a recruiter, or you have an opportunity to ask questions about the process, if that is something that is of concern to you or that you want to know about, being sure to ask about what that process looks like and asking for specifics. And then one thing I thought was interesting is the 36% said that they felt age bias from both humans and AI. And that 27% said they perceived race or ethnicity bias from both. I think one thing to keep in mind with AI tools is that, they're generally trained by people. So, it's interesting to see biases that may come out in an interview with a human, that you may also face that in an interview with an AI tool. So I thought that was interesting, where you would think that maybe you'd be less likely to encounter that in there. The results from this survey, at least, are showing that that may not be the case. Will mentioned in the comments that his company is piloting an AI coaching tool for that exact purpose. Right at the end of my time in my role, we were doing a demo with a vendor that we were considering using to replace our video recorded interview platform. And so this was in 2021 when we did this demo, and you would the student would upload their resume to it. And then based on the resume, the AI tool would, one, it would give them feedback on their resume. Two, it would pull using the resume. It would then craft a specific set of interview questions for the individual, and it would respond, it would adjust based on their answer to their questions. So if if they brought up a specific skill in an answer, the next question they might get a question about that skill, right? So that was in 2021. So I can't imagine how much more sophisticated, and it was really like sophisticated at the time. It was very cool. Also very expensive, so we did not we did not sign on for it. But I can't imagine how those have grown since then. And so I do think it's important when we're preparing for interviews that we're still utilizing the STAR technique, but you could be sharing that example with AI. So to just be prepared for that. Renata mentioned in the chat that we have a partnership with Career IO. Do you want to talk a little bit about that, Renata? We have a few minutes.
Sure. Yeah, on the topic of AI and especially in terms of practicing for regardless what the interview is, Career.io has a lot of different tools. So similar to what Jamie was saying, and maybe similar to Will's company and their partnership there. They ask you certain questions. It's like a prompted interview, mock interview. So you speak whatever your answer is to said question. It records it. It gives you feedback for different things you can work on, whether that's physically if you're fidgety or things that you might be less aware of that you're saying. So whether it's filler words or the actual prompt itself, if you're not as focused in your response or clear enough. So it's very thorough and it's um, in what it receives and what you say. But Career.io also has a lot of resume building tools. It has a job search feature. So it's a really holistic component in terms of the job search and incorporates a lot of different AI usage, which I think for the current market and given that a lot of um, jobs and industries are also using it for different purposes, I think it's a good um, advantage point. And as an ODK member, you also get different discounts through the platform. So yeah, so if anyone is interested, feel free to check it out. We have more information on it on our website. And I'm also happy to share more if anyone has questions.
Yeah, I would think about, when you're taking advantage of opportunities to prepare for interviewing, mock interviews are really common. Most career services offices offer mock interviews. For anyone who's not currently a student, you may still have access to your career services office as a benefit of like your alumni association or things like that. So I always recommend checking for that to see if that's still a resource that's available to you. But ODK likes to sort of on top of that offer these sorts of tools. So I think that, doing a mock interview with a human and doing a mock interview with AI is going to really set you up for being prepared for both because you're very likely going to encounter both types of interviews within your job search process. So, getting some practice on both ends of that spectrum would be really important so you feel comfortable in both settings. Are there any other questions that you guys have? Like I said, y'all are welcome to unmute or you can type them into the chat. But any other questions or comments, concerns, anything like that that y'all would want to ask or share at this point? Okay. So Renata is going to send out an email to follow up that'll have the recording of today's call. I'll have my email address. She's also going to include a link to my LinkedIn account. You guys are welcome to send me a connection request on there. Maybe drop into the note that you were a webinar attendee. I don't always accept connections from folks I don't know, but if you drop in there that you were in the interviewing webinar, I'd be happy to accept the connection. Yeah, if there are any questions that you guys have or anything that we can help with, please feel free to reach out. Thank you guys so much for your attendance today. I hope you learned a lot. And we will have, do we have a date set for the next webinar, Renata?
Not yet, but you can be on the lookout for sometime in June. We'll be having another professional development, career development oriented webinar. So if this is of interest to you, definitely keep joining us. And thank you, Jamie, and thank you to everyone who participated today. We really appreciate you all.
All right, thank you. I'll take